Hi everyone, my name is Stefan and I'll be presenting a few key normative issues in the choice of methods for valuing EQ-5D-Y. Perhaps this could start at the question, what are normative issues? Often, for clarity, these are contrasted to descriptive issues, where descriptive issues describe what is happening in the world right now, whereas normative issues or normative questions deal with value judgments, what ought or what should to happen, or what we consider as normal, right, or correct. In the context of valuation of EQ-5D-Y, normative questions or issues that you could consider are: which sample should be recruited to value EQ-5D-Y? Which perspective should be used in this sample? Which method is the best in this context? And do we want consistency between adult and child health state evaluation? Well, the last of these four questions I'm going to park and hope Nancy and Richard go into this to some extent. The first three questions will be focal in my presentation today. Now, I'd like to point out that it is not sensible for one person, in this case me, to provide a single answer to such questions, because it's just my personal view. But in my case, I would say I'm particularly unqualified to provide such answers, given that I've only worked on these issues for a relatively short while, as well as having transitioned from a completely different field. So whenever I'm presenting my own views, I will be indicating that these takes are unqualified. However, it's not just my opinions that I'll be presenting here today, because the work that I'm presenting here today is based on two EuroQol funded projects. One is a collaboration with Vivian Reckers and Simone Krijmeijer, which led to a paper on the rationale and implications of the perspective used for EQ-5D-Y published in Value and Health, and also a workshop organized by Kunal Shah's principal investigator with a team that also included Vivian, Paul Schneider, David Mott, and Simon McNamara. Now, this workshop invited over 20 attendees with various backgrounds to discuss these conceptual challenges, where our goal was to find out if there's consensus or majority views on particular matters, if there's disagreements, and also to identify opportunities for future research, either empirical or normative. Now, my own journey thinking about these matters started when trying to extend my relatively newly obtained insight onto why and how we value adult health to valuing child health. And I questioned where the shoe pinched. And it is particularly the role of age and how we handle age that is particularly surprising to me still. For example, have a look at this scale here, where we consider someone who is zero, for example, people from 0 years old to the end of their life. When we consider the measurement instrument to be used, we use EQ-5D-5L for individuals aged 16 years and older, and for individuals between 8 and 15, we would recommend use of EQ-5D-Y. Now, when we consider who values these instruments, so what preferences are included in the value set, for adults, so for EQ-5D-5L, we only include individuals aged 18 years and older. This happens regardless of the age of the individual that fills out the instrument. So say someone who is 45 fills out EQ-5D-5L, we use a value set not only made out of the opinions of those that are the same age. Now, we include people of all ages 18 and over. Now, an argumentation often given for this type of decision is that the distribution of health should be based on preferences elicited from society for states that they may or may not come to live in, which is a sort of a combination between view of ignorance and arguing for a societal perspective. But what is it that we do for EQ-5D-Y? Consider, for example, someone who is 15 years old who has filled out EQ-5D-Y. Here we ask an adult sample to value those states taking the perspective of a 10-year-old child. So we have an explicit age, but it's an age that is different than the person who is filling it out. So something kind of surprising is happening there. Furthermore, the argumentation doesn't neatly translate, because we ask adults to value states for an instrument that is not even used to measure their health, whereas the preferences of those potential beneficiaries, say the 15-year-olds or the 8-year-olds, these are not explicitly included in the valuation sample at all. So, what were the key takeaways of the workshop in which these normative issues were also discussed? First, the discussion surrounded questions on why is child health even different than adult health. And one issue that came up is that children are not necessarily autonomous, legally, ethically, or physically. Instead, it is normal even, or sometimes desirable, that certain decisions are made for them by adults who have their best interests in mind. So this paternalistic view could be seen as a normative foundation. This also suggests that there should be a greater role for parents and guardians, although there was disagreement on whether this is indeed desirable, because they have responsibility for such decisions in practice. However, there was consensus that there's no conclusive normative foundation, or in other words, guidance on what it is that we should be measuring and maximizing in health state valuation, and why, so based on which principles. And this doesn't necessarily exist for adults, and for child health state valuation, therefore not also such foundation doesn't necessarily exist. And it was questioned if it ever will. Therefore, it was also discussed in the workshop that there could be a pluralistic view on how child health is valued, because children and their roles in society differ between cultures and countries, as well as between children of different ages. Hence, that might suggest that we could use many different value sets or valuation methods. However, an unqualified question that I would raise then is this holds for adults as well as children. Adults also differ between ages, cultures, and countries. And here we use the same valuation set and method across individuals all ages. That leads to some sort of inconsistent foundation. The next question that was key to the workshop was the combination of which samples should be recruited and which perspective should we then use in that context. Where a prerequisite question you could ask is what knowledge should respondents valuing child health have actually? Should they have knowledge of what it means to be a child, knowledge of what it means to be in ill health, experience with death, or should they have a good understanding of time, for example? You could ask what the right procedure is for valuing health and based on what insights. Should it be democratically aligned? Should it be based on principles of taxation or self-determination, meaning that we want patients or children to value their own health because it's about them? Another question that you could ask to answer these normative questions is what is actually possible in practice, taking into account what is ethically feasible, the capabilities of the respondents, and whether or not there would be resistance in particular groups to particular approaches. Now, based on these questions, the team identified 40 possible combinations of sources and perspectives that you could use. Now, in discussing with the attendees at the respondents, a consensus view was that it was seen as desirable to have children or adolescents value their own health for multiple reasons. However, there was large discussion on whether or not this is practically feasible. The current approach, where adult proxy valuations are used, might be acceptable when the methodology that we want to use is not feasible for children. But an unqualified take on this is that this means that we prioritize feasibility and practical considerations over considerations epistemic and procedural, meaning what people need to know and what principles we feel should guide health state valuation. And I wonder if this is a desirable prioritization. This part of the workshop also identified that family units, so combinations of parents and children, may offer unique opportunities to value health state EQ-5D-Y health states. Next part of the workshop dealt with the question of which valuation method is best. Beforehand, the 5 methods that you see here on the screen were identified as having been used in valuation of child health in earlier research. Now, each method has its own strengths and drawbacks that I will go into in a second. But I won't be discussing visual analog scale or standard gamble because in the workshop there was consensus that these methods are not necessarily feasible or suitable in the context of valuation of child health, and for some respondents not even for valuation of adult health states, for some people in the workshop. Now, one advantage of time trade-off is that it explicitly involves the trade-off between length of life and quality of life, which is so focal in quality adjusted life years. A drawback is that it conflates valuation of quality of life with the value of lifetime, in which phenomena such as loss aversion or discounting, which have or describe how people view lifetime, these have a strong influence on time trade-off results. Discrete choice experiments and best-worst scaling have a advantage that they are seen as less demanding, but the disadvantage is that it's not clear how these methods should be anchored on the quality scale. An advantage of both methods, at least discrete choice experiment and time trade-off, is that these are the methods which the EuroQol group has used extensively. So regardless of the problems that these methods have, they are the devils that we know. So what are the key takeaways from the workshop for the methods? Well, as I mentioned, standard gamble and visual analog scale are not feasible or recommended, regardless of the perspective actually used. Also, there was consensus that children cannot complete time trade-off without additional assistance. The use of ordinal methods, such as discrete choice experiment and best-worst scaling, is seen as highly feasible. There were some disagreements on certain matters. For example, there was disagreement on the feasibility and the necessity of using time trade-off with a proxy perspective, so asking adults to value child health. There was also disagreement on whether or not the value of child life years would be different between adults in the view of adults and differ from the value of adult life years, for example. And some of the qualitative research and quantitative research that I've been involved in actually gives a suggestion that there's big differences between the two. Also, there were questions and disagreements surrounding whether or not ordinal preferences measured by discrete choice experiments or best-worst scaling would be different for children of different ages or children described as being having a different age. Now, in the methods part of the workshop, there were also a few opportunities identified. Particularly, there's a lot of opportunity for more research on how to anchor discrete choice experiments and best-worst scaling, which is seen as a highly feasible method. Also, it was suggested that research could be done on how to assist children or adolescents to complete time trade-off. So some final unqualified thoughts to round off my presentation. What I saw in the workshops is that discussions surrounding what the right approach is for valuation of child health is often conflated with what individuals feel is wrong with valuation of adult health. And seeing that both lack a conclusive normative foundation, it might be good to separate the two. A second point is that when we discuss the feasibility of methods, we are often overly pessimistic of what children and adolescents can and cannot do, while simultaneously we are much less critical of similar methodological problems in adult respondents. I think this is surprising, and perhaps the group should give this some thought. A third and final thought is that there is a unique opportunity, I believe, for using separate sources and perspectives for determining the length of the utility scale and the importance of domains. It is already recommended to do this in terms of the methods used, where time trade-off is used in a different group than discrete choice experiments in the EQ-5D-Y valuation protocol. But as Ludwig and colleagues discussed in the context of patient versus general public utilities, it might also be relevant to consider different sources or even perspectives, where we use in one group and one particular method, perspective and source for determining the length of the scale, and perhaps we include adolescents or children to determine the importance of the domain. And I think there is a lot of opportunity to improve the protocol in this direction. Now, some final thoughts before I round off. I think it's good to keep in mind that there's unlikely ever going to be a holy grail of normative health state valuation, a perfect approach that will satisfy everyone that we are all searching for. Instead, I think it's useful to see these discussions as a way of discovery, of finding out how adult and child health valuation differs and should differ, finding out disagreements between different people and why they exist. And I've found this workshop, as well as the previous workshop, to be a very fruitful endeavor and stimulating in that regard.